Hey everybody, JJ back here again, talking about some more of my favorite drummers, and this particular gentleman might know the band, but this guy is definitely one of those drummers where when I tell people he's probably he's definitely I think in my top 10 influences, and nobody really knows who he is by name. His nickname is probably a little bit more kind of out there than his actual real name. But you know the band that he plays in, and this is the band. They're not as old as some of my early. The band is younger than my early influences, so they came to me at a time when I was 18 or 19. I had already kind of developed my taste and had been playing drums for quite a few years at that point. And but I was always kind of looking for new music at that time. I was still developing, and my ears were open to new things. And at this time I had gotten into this is the new metal era, and so you're talking 1998 through 2001 sort of thing, and so at that time System of a Down, Korn, Deftones are in the mix there as well. And so via Slipknot, this band came to my attention. I believe Clown, Sean Crahan, who's one of the percussionists in Slipknot, he had produced or something to do with this first album. And the band is Mudvayne, and the drummer's name is Matt McDonough. You might know him as Spug or Spag, or he's got these weird nicknames. He's got a few different ones, but Matt McDonough is the drummer. And getting to my discovery of him, reading a bunch of heavy metal magazines at the end of the 90s, exposure to bands, and you're seeing, seem to be like visually striking bands were kind of the flavor of the times, I guess. And so Slipknot had already broken at that point and were the biggest band of 1999 in that genre anyways, making tons of waves and becoming slightly notorious around that time. And so I was very much into them and their drummer. And the other percussionist in the band, Sean Crahan, comes on board to produce the Mudvayne album. And it's not the first Mudvayne album. There was a previous release to this, kind of a indie, more like a demo. So this is their first major label release. I couldn't tell you, Sony maybe, I forget the label, but the album is called LD50. And I remember reading about this and seeing the band and the visuals, and I always thought the band had a very striking look. Maybe in hindsight, it's kind of like a little silly or whatever, but there was just something striking and interesting about it. And they all had their own makeup and their own kind of look and their own individuality, and it was intriguing from that standpoint. But it was when I heard the first song that I heard from that album, and it was a song called Death Blooms, and I was trying to remember where I may have heard it, and I honestly have no idea where I heard that song first. It may have been on a compilation CD or something. Back in the day, magazines sometimes would include CDs that would have 3 or 4 songs on them that would have new bands they were talking about or whatever, and it's possible I could have gotten it off one of those. I wish I could remember, because as far as influence in drumming goes, it was like that was the right time and the right place for me to discover a drummer like Matt. I had just kind of previously started, listening to Tool. I'd listened to Tool, but kind of opened myself up more to odd time signatures and, arrangements and unconventional ideas in drumming. And I just talked in a previous video about Danny Carey, and he was talking about numerology and all these things, and I always found numbers and those things kind of interesting. And Matt McDonough comes along, and the first interview I kind of read with him, he's talking about how the arrangements of Mudvayne songs are all based on these kind of numerology ideas and the power of numbers, and uh, numbers being universal language. The number one means the same thing in basically every country, and it means the same thing to every person on earth. Music can be universal language, and numbers are also that. And so they really tied these things in together. And listening to Matt's drumming, there are a million times where it feels like on initial listens, it can be very challenging because it almost has a square peg into a round hole kind of thing going on, where the idea behind the drumming and the numbering and the just the arrangement with these numbers is so strong that it just, like, the drumming feels forced in some ways to adhere to these numbering systems, and it just flies in the face of what you would think a typical drum arrangement would be. The songs from a guitar standpoint aren't on the LD50 album, it's definitely new metal, it's definitely heavy. They only had one guitar player, this guy Greg Tribbett or something, Gerg is his name, and a bass player, Ryan Martini. And Ryan Martini might be one of the most underrated bass players in rock. That guy's a phenomenally talented bass player. And the bass and the drums really have this crazy syncopation in Mudvayne that's kind of almost like unlike anything I'd heard and maybe have heard since. It's very unique to that band. A lot of like kind of fusion and jazz, like progressive kind of things going on under the guise of like more heavy metal drumming, and it's very, very unique, very, very unique band. Very interesting time in music for accepting these kinds of things. So I hear Death Blooms is the first thing I hear, and I'm very much intrigued by it. A great chorus. It has like the typical nu metal aggro vocals, or these types of things that were typical of that time. But the singer was Chad Gray. The singer Chad Gray is capable of singing as well, and he has this really. The chorus has these very kind of beautiful, not quite beautiful in a sense, but compared to the rest of the song, there's these very nice, melody lines and things like that, and kind of lift the chorus up into this other realm, which I found very appealing. So hearing the one song, instantly I'm like, well, I'm intrigued by this. I'm going to get the album. And so getting the album, I've been talking a lot about concept albums in the last little bit, and little to my realization is that LD50 is also kind of a concept album, in the sense of the lyrical themes talk into like a lot of pharmacological ideas, drug experimentation, like all these just kind of, I couldn't tell you all the exact references, but there's definitely a theme that's going on, with human development and like just progress through humanity, and like going from like jellyfish to the apes that man has become, and like all these really, really cool ideas. I couldn't think of the guy. Terrence McKenna might be his name. That was the drug drug advocate, and he talked about doing these drug experiments to expand the human psyche, and it's very much a theme on this album. And musically, it kind of lends itself to that as well. There's all these like soundscapes and all these like just things you can kind of get lost in the recording. But then the songs, like I have to look up because I can never remember the song titles. But there's just these incredible songs, like Dig. That was the first single, I believe, off of that. Not the first song I heard, but the first single. And, that's just kind of a straight ahead, pretty heavy song. opens the record. There's a segue that opens the record, and then we get into Dig. And that song might be a fan favorite, but when you take the rest of the album and the rest of the drumming into consideration, it kind of falls a little bit further down the line for me. The drumming on this album it was so different than anything that I'd ever heard. It was so busy, and there had been drummers that I'd listened to that would have been considered busy. Like even Lars Ulrich from Metallica at times has been overly busy with drum fills, and in the 80s and things like that. But this was like nothing I'd kind of ever really picked up at the time. It was just busy for the sake of being busy, and it was like challenging you almost. Where it's just like the drums are, in a sense, the lead instrument on this album, and rhythmically they're the lead. They control a lot of the dynamic and a lot of the just the feel of the album and stuff like that. I don't know what the songwriting process was for these guys, but I'd love to pick their brains at some point and find out. Internal Primates Forever, very, very interesting, drumming arrangement for that. Lots of double bass littered throughout. This album was a really excellent album for me to exercise along to. At that time, I was still kind of developing double bass chops, and there's a lot of syncopated playing, so a lot of patterns that aren't linear. They stop, they start, they break up in different ways. There's just a lot of drumming to take in. And at the time I was listening to this album, I mean, there was, besides the Dig music video, there was nothing to go by. And repetitive listens, just hours and hours and hours on end, listening to this to remember these drum parts. I've always had kind of a good memory for remembering songs, and sometimes I haven't listened to this album in a very long time, and I'm surprised I can even recall the arrangements for some of these songs. I must have just burned this album into my brain by listening to it so much. But I was so compelled by what was going on, it was hard not to. Eternal Primates Forever, I mentioned. -1 is a really cool kind of mid-tempo. Has another cool kind of double bass thing towards the end. Death Blooms, which is the first song I heard. Very, very cool song, and complex arrangement for the drumming. And it's if you're just interested in kind of composition for drums, it's a interesting, very, very interesting to listen to. One of my favorite songs to play on drums. I've covered a few of these songs already. Cradle is a great song for drums. Everything and Nothing. Almost positive I've covered that already, but I'd like to get back to it at some point. Just very recently I covered my favorite song to play off of this record, which is a song called Under My Skin. And Under My Skin was one I sat and practiced quite a bit because it was challenging due to the tempo. There's a lot of stop starts. There's very kind of just these jagged kind of drum parts, and just once again a lot of drumming. This album is just packed with drum ideas. If you ever feel like you're stuck and you can't come up with ideas for something, it's listen to this album. It's just chock full of these crazy ideas, and once again, at some points it kind of can feel like a square peg in a round hole. It doesn't feel like it fits, but they just massage the songs to a way where initially you're kind of troubled by what it feels like or where you think it should have gone, but then on the second or third listen you're like, wow, these are they zigged where they should have zagged, sort of thing. And it creates this very, very unique sound that clearly just belongs to these guys. There wasn't another band at the time that was, close to them. And as far as musicianship goes, these guys were, all top-notch players, especially the rhythm section. That's the real showcase of this band. The bass and drums are just kind of they have all the elements of being progressive and fusion and these really complex rhythmic trade-offs and polyrhythms between bass and drums. this is an album that really taught me like what polyrhythms are. And I don't know, I've never really read that many interviews with Matt McDonough to know where his influences came from for these kinds of things. He's very seems like a very private individual, and I've only ever seen one interview with him in Modern Drummer, and he had an interesting point where he didn't even really want to talk about drums. Like, he's the drummer, but he didn't kind of like, I'm paraphrasing, but he didn't kind of like even associate with being the drummer of the band. Like, the interview is all about these concepts that are more, in Mudvayne's songwriting and composition than it is talking about actual, drums and influences and things like that. So he's got a very interesting mindset as well when it comes to even his thoughts about his role as a drummer. If I ever get a chance to meet him, I'd hope that I have the wherewithal to remember these kinds of things. Some of these, the last interview I read with him was, that was just talking about music and not like the kind of goings on with Mudvayne, was at least 15 years ago, something like that. But it's such an interesting way to approach it. And, clearly it's like the artist, the artist mentality or whatever, and you want to view yourself as more than a drummer sort of thing. But like, his ability as a drummer is kind of off the charts. So, he obviously studied and he obviously played and all these other things, but he's never really talked about it. And so that's very intriguing to me, and something I'd love to. I'd hope he'd be willing to open up about if I ever had a chance to speak with him, but because it was just massively influential on me. And I can, as I think back at the time that I heard that album, and how I started playing immediately in the aftermath of kind of taking all this in and learning this album. I pretty much learned this whole album top to bottom when it came out as an exercise, but also I enjoyed the music quite a bit. It was very challenging, and remembering the arrangements it's still to this day quite daunting. But yeah, drumming on Under My Skin, there's a lot of double bass stuff that's there. Very challenging at that tempo once again. The arrangement, the intricacies, a lot of hi-hat work, and just like barks and, these accents, a lot of accents all over the place. Pharmacopoeia is another great song as well. They're all challenging. I shouldn't even get into the minutia of all the songs. All the songs on this album are challenging. Later on, the album that's released after this also escapes my mind. If I could find it here very quickly. The End of All Things to Come. Sadly, that's kind of the end of my affinity with Mudvayne as well. They moved into a much different direction after this record. And so the drumming on The End of All Things to Come is kind of like a 2.0 of LD50. And all the influence I took from LD50 was also applied to The End of All Things to Come. There was the single off of that album. The first one I heard was a song called Not Falling, which has these really long kind of double bass parts, which are very challenging to play. It's a great song too. It's a great hook, good chorus, great chorus, and a wonderful song. But then also with the elements of Mudvayne mixed in there, and it makes it very challenging. World So Cold, I think, was probably the one that maybe everybody may have heard. It was a big MTV song, and it was kind of the one they pushed as a single at the time. And it really interesting tom, like a melodic tom phrasing at the end of that song. And I couldn't tell you what time signature or the polyrhythm that he's playing underneath, but very cool. I really picked up on that. He's multi-tom player and has a lot of voicings like that to choose from, which I always thought was really cool. We get into some of the later material from Mudvayne, and I don't know what happened after the second album, whether there's like a record industry pressure to kind of, follow a more typical approach, whatever it is, like, the music's too inaccessible. I don't know. It moves into just kind of more typical nu metal territory post that album for me. There's a few standout songs that the drumming really stand out on the album, Lost and Found. Just looking up the name here very quickly of the songs. I never ever remember songs. It always adds so much to the videos, I know, but a song like I Am N is a song that that's harkens back to the old style kind of Mudvayne for me, and it has a very complex drum arrangement, and it's not one of those songs you can kind of wing it or kind of do your own thing, because the drum part is so intrinsically tied to the actual song itself. A lot of complexity, a lot of just if you listen to the song, you'll see what I'm saying. It's quite the exercise. Rain, Sun, Gone's another one from that record. Once you get past that album, Mudvayne kind of falls off the radar for me. I'm changing musically. I had mentioned in another video at that time, 2007, I'm kind of at the end of my phase with, really chasing progressive music and complex drumming and ideas. And, not that I'd achieved everything there, but it was just like things started to feel like I was just, complex for complexity's sake versus trying to find some kind of a musical connection to it. And so around that time, I start drifting away from, the more complex songs, drifting away from nu metal kind of in general, and, looking back towards the past and, some of the early 70s and, the roots of rock and roll, Deep Purple, these types of bands. And so Matt McDonough has a very important place in the lineage of my musical kind of upbringing and my drumming history. And my chops in double bass they're not as good now. I don't practice this stuff as much, but at one point, because I played along to this album, LD50 in particular, so much, I felt like I could play anything. Just the accuracy that I developed from practicing along to it, the power. Around that time, it was just, double bass was my realm, and I practiced anything and everything I could get my hands on, whether it was, more complex patterns or whether it was, black metal kind of speedier things. Like I was all into it, and it's a part of my drumming kind of upbringing, and it's kind of fallen by the wayside a bit, and I'm getting older and mellowing out a bit and stuff, and Matt McDonough, Mudvayne's kind of come back around in the last little while, and so I think more people are recognizing the band for, it's important in that small time frame. Its importance in that small time frame. And the cool thing is now that Mudvayne's kind of had a little bit of a resurgence, is that there's forever there was only like one live video, like a live in Peoria or something, a concert video Mudvayne released, and that was really all there was to see Matt's playing, which was great. I studied that a lot. But now with Mudvayne's resurgence, you're starting to see more videos of Matt playing, which is amazing, because he's akin to Neil Peart in a way, where basically the songs are arranged and that's how they are forever. He's not an improvisational player by any means, and it's very cool to see that him being able to replicate these songs live, and to the degree of accuracy that he needs to do it is something else to behold altogether. So I'm hoping Matt finally is going to get, I know he has it, but I would love to see, just him held in the same regard as, like a Danny Carey or some of these guys. I think Matt deserves it. The band doesn't have quite the renown of a band like Tool, but as far as ability and creativity and things like that go, I think Matt definitely deserves that. So if you haven't ever checked out Mudvayne, LD50 would be my suggestion. Pick a song on there. It's a cool album to sit down to as a full experience. Have a beer and listen to it. Have whatever you want and listen to it. It's interesting in that capacity. But this is the one about Matt McDonough from Mudvayne. Check him out if you haven't checked him out. Cheers.